This week on Act Out, it might sound like common sense that poverty affects our overall health, but did you know that income inequality catalyzes wear and tear on a micromolecular level? Science has a disturbing new scoop. Next up, please, please, please do not go to these kind of protests. And finally, a local grassroots initiative to address an often overlooked aspect of our immigration crisis. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. For many of us, the fact that income inequality makes people and planet unhealthy isn't breaking news. But a recent series of articles in Scientific American delves deeper, all the way to the molecular level, beyond what our own experience and common sense has shown. Robert M. Sapolsky, professor of biological sciences, neurology, and neurological sciences at Stanford University, along with other academics, has long been researching the, quote, stressful psychosocial consequences of low SES, or socioeconomic status. In other words, what does being poor do to your mental, physical, and emotional health? And more than that, what does feeling poor do to your health? As Sapolsky notes in his article, while poverty is bad for your health, poverty amid plenty, inequality, can be worse by just about any measure. Infant mortality, overall life expectancy, obesity, murder rates, and more. Health is particularly corroded by your nose constantly being rubbed in what you don't have. And of course, this makes sense, right? In our society, you're constantly told that your worth is quite literally your economic worth, your market value. If you don't have a job, you have failed, not the system. If you don't make enough to buy this and that other worthless piece of shit, that's on you, not on a system obsessed with material consumption that constantly devalues human connection and self-worth. For instance, in my special on Cuba, I talked about what folks had told me when I asked them to describe what Cuba valued. Their replies: community, solidarity, public health, the well-being of our neighbors. And these were not trite replies packaged and ready to deliver to any blonde tourist wandering around. These were well thought out and diversely detailed answers that all hinged on those ideals. Meanwhile, according to UN calculations, Cuba, thanks to our embargo, ranks 65th in the world with regards to GDP, just below Slovakia and just above Sudan. They are not a rich country, certainly nothing compared to the number one ranking country, i.e. ours. And yet people in Cuba have all their basic needs met. They have free education, free healthcare, free housing, basic foodstuffs. Income inequality is low. Was it a glistening utopia? No, not at all. But Cubans were honest and open about the shortcomings, something the US excels at, wrapping in shiny ads, lacing with opioids, and shoving down our collective consciousness. Indeed, Nikki Haley, on her way out, U.S. ambassador to the UN, said recently, quote, "It is patently ridiculous for the United Nations to examine poverty in America." Not because it's so fucking obvious, but because, according to Haley, we do not have a problem with poverty. And it's this kind of denial, cover-up, out-of-touchness, and constant poverty-shaming that supports Sapolsky's findings that being poor in a supposed land of plenty only exacerbates the health strains associated with poverty in general. Inequality, more so than poverty in general, produces societies with worse qualities of life, starting with a basic human need: connection. Put simply, steep hierarchy is the antithesis of the equality and symmetry that nourish friendship. And this goes for the wealthy pieces of shit at the top, too. Of course, it's not nearly as bad, but as Sapolsky notes, it is stressful to construct thick walls to keep everything stressful out. The rich in this country spend oodles to ensure their kids don't have to go to those bad public schools. They spend millions on gated communities that have better filtration systems for air and water, away from the dregs that they wouldn't deign to share their wealth with. They pour millions into political campaigns to make sure that they stay at the top rather than investing to bring the bottom up. So the bottom stays down. Economically, but more importantly, health-wise. Scientists have found 3 main areas that connect directly to external inequality: chronic inflammation, chromosomal aging, and brain function. So let's look first at chronic inflammation. Your body is pretty damn smart, and it will try to protect itself by making smaller sacrifices in the short term. So, for instance, if you cut your finger and it gets infected, a whole slew of functions shift to address this, from how your body processes fat to how your brain regulates sleep. Scientists call this allostasis. In other words, in order to find balance, certain bodily functions will run at subpar levels, which in the long run actually result in damage far more serious than one single thing having gone really wrong initially. Chronic inflammation is one of the key ways that the body deals with a heavy allostatic load, how it processes the increased and constant stress. Over time, chronic inflammation greatly increases your risk for a wide array of illnesses, from memory loss and cognitive decline to compromised digestive function, to joint pain and loss of mobility, to heart disease, to Alzheimer's. With regards to SES, or again socioeconomic status, researchers have linked this to a heavy allostatic load because the body is in constant and futile battle to return to a normal, non-stressed state. And this manifests in a variety of ways. An increased release of stress hormones, increases in blood pressure, cholesterol, blood lipids, and indicators of hyperglycemia. Even more disturbing, low childhood SES leaves a strong lifelong mark, suggesting that poor kids in the US today are significantly more likely to suffer from chronic inflammation later in life, which in turn means that poor kids today are more likely to have heart disease than their rich counterparts, based on nothing else but their market value at birth. And it goes even deeper than this, molecularly deep. So telomeres are the little caps at the end of chromosomes, those green things in the image, like the plastic caps at the end of shoelaces that keep them from fraying. Telomeres help keep our chromosomes stable, and molecular biologists can judge a cell's biological age based on the state of the telomeres. In other words, these little caps are the molecular manifestation of wear and tear. Telomeres can be rebuilt via an enzyme, the aptly named telomerase, but guess what? Studies show that those living with severe stress not only had shortened telomeres, but lower levels of telomerase to rebuild those frayed ends. Studies in depression, PTSD, and racial injustice all found this to be the case, meaning that inequality literally breaks us down on a molecular level. And here again, research shows that if you spend your childhood in poverty, by middle age, your telomeres will probably be about a decade older than those with more fortunate childhoods. But wait, there's more. From body systems to molecular biology to the brain, Sapolsky's more than 20 years of research has found that 3 big areas of the brain are hugely impacted by the stress associated with income inequality. The hippocampus, which is critical to learning and memory, the amygdala, which deals with fear and anxiety, and finally the prefrontal cortex, which deals with planning, impulse control, and executive function. So here again, we see how low SES advances memory impairment as well as anxiety, depression, vulnerability to addiction. Without any hyperbole, science shows us that we are condemning the poor, also kids, to mental, emotional, physical, down to the molecular level anguish just because they were born poor. And yet we're the richest country in the world. We're the richest country in the world, but according to the newly released Credit Suisse 2018 Global Wealth Data Book, 34 million American adults, or 1 in 7, are among the world's poorest 10%. The world's poorest. And as noted back in episode 181, we are past due for another worse recession. It shouldn't have to take reports like this one to snap us out of this grotesquely abusive relationship with capitalism. And as Sapolsky notes in his own article about his own research, it should not require us to measure inflammation or the length of chromosomes to prove that this is wrong. Yeah, it really, really shouldn't. But when you live in a time when the truth is considered as unimportant as the poor, when science is ridiculed just as much as the idea of human rights, you can't actually prove that something is wrong until you make it right. As I say on so many, if not all of my shows, we cannot wait for change to come from the enlightenment of some. We have to use this knowledge, spread it, share it, but build with it. Convert this mental energy into the energy of real change, because knowledge isn't so much power as it is potential. The potential to really address the systemic issues that oppress us all. What can you do today, this week, this month, to address the income inequality and poverty around you? To challenge this sick playbook of capitalism? Think about it. Act on it. So before we dive into our interview this week, I want to address something that happened last week that really pissed me off. Jeff Sessions was ousted as Attorney General and replaced by Matthew Whitaker, who will now be overseeing the Russian meddling shit show of an investigation. And that's not what pisses me off. In fact, I could give two shits. The question is, why does this shift from one asshole to another asshole warrant nationwide protests against the firing of one of those assholes? A self-proclaimed racist, along with signage like this stating, "Protect Mueller?" Well, that was my question. One that went unanswered by the multiple orgs who sent emails and texts asking me to take to the streets to protect Mueller. Are you fucking serious? Protect the former head of the FBI, a rich white conservative Republican who is now on a fucking witch hunt for non-existent Russian collusion that's being used by the state-sponsored corporations as an excuse to perpetuate the censorship and suppression of dissident voices and media? What? No. Fuck Mueller. Let's just break this down for a second.
As Director Tenet has pointed out, Secretary Powell presented evidence last week that Baghdad has failed to disarm its weapons of mass destruction, willfully attempting to evade and deceive the international community. Our particular concern is that Saddam Hussein may supply terrorists with biological, chemical, or radiological material.
You want to protect that guy? Some 1 million Iraqis dead, the creation of ISIS. But yeah, let's get him some job security. Mueller was the FBI director for 12 years, the longest run since Hoover, from Bush to Obama, when the FBI expanded its reach from the good old-fashioned COINTELPRO political prisoner maker to a player in the global surveillance racket. Indeed, back in 2013, the Washingtonian reported with apparent glee that a world map in the deputy director's office shows more than 60 locations abroad, where FBI agents are now posted, and bureau leaders talk of its reach from Indianapolis to Islamabad. As Mueller says, the FBI has never faced a more complex threat environment than it does today, whether one considers terrorism, espionage, cyber-based attacks, or traditional crimes. Yeah, thanks to Mueller. Mueller, as you saw in that clip, played an integral role in the rise of the war on terror, both at home and abroad, from Islamophobia, the targeting of Muslims in the U.S., to the spread of Bush's and Obama's lies to perpetuate war in the Middle East. And despite threatening to resign in 2004 due to the warrantless spying on U.S. residents, he stayed. And he said in a 2013 interview with CNN that if NSA had been collecting all of the intelligence it does today, before 9/11, the attack may have been prevented. So I guess you're feeling kind of splintered on that largest surveillance network in the history of fucking humanity, aren't you, Bob? Fast forward to today's shit show, he was put in charge of the investigation into Russian meddling in our elections. Something I have reported on and written about, and something that no one has been able to prove in any way. And even before last week, corporate media was lubing everybody up for the letdown. Prepare for disappointment. And Mueller won't indict Trump. And guess what? Whatever he finds, you'll probably never be allowed to see anyway, so you'll just have to trust whatever the Department of Justice tells you. It was always going to be a shitty magic trick, because there's nothing to find. The Dems brought out Cold War smoke and mirrors, dusted them off, and now we can all see our own fears staring us right in the face, and we're ready to jump when they say to. This isn't about Trump. It's a Democrat-made folk devil to avoid addressing their own failures. If you wanted to impeach Trump, you could have done that 10 times over via the emoluments clause alone. No sleazeball-run FBI investigation necessary. But that's not the point. The point is fear. Truly, all they have to do is hand you the raggedy old used folk devil and it's Johnny get your gun and kill a commie for mommy all over again. I mean, people were literally out in the streets demanding that Sessions be reinstated just so we could finish our three-ring circus show. Meanwhile, on his way out, Sessions, the KKK darling, drastically limited the ability of federal law enforcement officials to use court-enforced agreements to overhaul local police departments accused of abuses and civil rights violations. This on top of all the shit he's already done to stoke the war on drugs and horrifically racist policing and law enforcement. Even the ACLU decided to chime in with this email aptly titled Protect Mueller. Quote, Sessions was the worst attorney general in modern history. But if he's out, then the Russia investigation is in serious danger. Let me translate. Essentially, what the ACLU and everyone out there at those protests is saying is that following the powers that be on their magic Pied Piper witch hunt is easily worth a few dozen black lives. Give or take 100 or so. Black Lives Matter after we get the Russians. Don't you see how fucking twisted that is? It's like saying, yeah, Hitler was the worst, but I mean those Jews, come on. And not one person can come up with any proof that Russians fucked with our elections at all. Meanwhile, any fool with the Google tool can find ample evidence of how we fuck with our elections all the time. I mean, hell, where were these irate texts and emails the day after the elections when voter suppressions kept millions from casting a ballot? Broken machines, hours in line, provisional, aka useless ballots, millions knocked off the voter rolls. Where were these national actions then? Where's the coordinated response to any of the issues with ample proof, from environmental destruction to one of humanity's largest genocides ever in Yemen that we're helping to drive? What the fuck, people? How can you go out into the streets and demand that we protect this man when you won't lift a damn finger to protect those who actually need it, i.e. anyone else? Women, indigenous, black, brown, poor, disabled, you're asking people to perpetuate violence and ignore crises for the sake of a badly written fairy tale. Wake up! And yes, I'm getting really fucking riled up about this because this is actually worse than doing nothing. Because it sends a message to both the people and the system that our job as people is to uphold the system's facade, to ensure that their storyline, their party lines are intact, that their lies mean the truth to us and that we will fight for these illusions till the end. That's not what activism is. That's not what engagement is. And that's sure as shit not what we need right now. And look, I get why it's tempting. It's like the Pussy Hat March, where folks thought that all we need is a woman in the White House, and then we can all do brunch. And if Mueller could just finish his bullshit investigation, we could pretend that our election system works perfectly well outside of those meddling Ruskies, and then again, go do brunch. Deeper activism on deeper issues requires us to realize that this shit is surface scum at best. And at worst, and realistically, it's a diversion crafted to avoid addressing the real pressing issues: climate change, income inequality, war. These are the issues that should push us out into the streets. So please, please, if you were thinking about going out there for Mueller, if you're thinking of tweeting or posting or talking more about it, don't. You're fueling a fire that is already raging. One that sucks the oxygen out of real organizing, real work, real issues. Do not give the system your power by kneeling to theirs. Look past the mirage to see the trash heap festering beneath those shiny Gap ads and delicate folk devils. Because we have real work to do. Finally today, an example of said real work. The Eastern Iowa Community Bond Project, a grassroots local initiative that works with detained immigrants and their families in order to pay bond and get folks out of detainment. This often overlooked side of immigrant detention and human rights is critical to avoiding deportation and sidestepping the mental, emotional, and physical devastation associated with our immigration policies. For more on this work, I sat down with Natalia Espina and Julia Zelensky, co-founders of the Eastern Iowa Community Bond Project. Take a look.
I really think that bond in immigration detention is one of the things that exposes how close to criminal detention it really is, right? It's jail, and that's just what it is. Because it works the same way. Someone is arrested, held in detention. It is possible for people to be released without bond, released on their own recognizance. But if they're not, the minimum bond amount is $1,500. So that's non-trivial, right? Particularly for many of the sort of people in the targeted populations. And then just like with criminal detention, if you can't pay the bond, you stay in detention. And immigration detention facilities are often literally jails, right? They're often county jails. Sometimes they're separate facilities that only do immigration, but it's being in jail is what it means, because you can't come up with this money.
So with regards to your specific role in this, how do you get access to the people that, like, how do you get in touch with the people who have a bond to pay, and then how do you go about paying that?
The first several months of our existence, probably, up to the first year, was really about sort of putting the premise of the project out there, letting people know what these sort of moving mechanisms are, what the importance of the intervention of paying bond is. So it was really a lot of education. So we've worked with a variety of sort of partners throughout the state to help us sort of disseminate information to potential partners. So a good variety of to potential affected communities. So a good part of our referrals have come in through people who work directly with affected communities. Currently, we actually have quite a few people who have been released who maybe know somebody who has been detained, and sort of the information has kind of just guided itself within the communities. That's happening a lot more now than it did when we first started. In terms of ways that people can get in touch with us, we do have an active phone line that folks are able to call in on, and then of course traditional methods like reaching us through email. But part of the premise in setting up at least a direct phone line or contact is because we don't want to have like additional technological barriers that might, impede people from contacting us.
What has been your experience with the folks that you've dealt with in paying bond? Have you heard about specific experiences inside? I mean, you mentioned that, these are basically like jails. Have they shared any of their experiences with you that have about what they've dealt with?
So I think, what we hear over and over again from people is just how isolating an experience that is, and how traumatizing it is they, even if you're going to have to participate in the system, and you're going to have to kind of show up and defend yourself in court and all of that, detention is such a coercive and isolating experience that really it really harms people and really traumatizes families. And I think that's one of the things that we hear just over and over and over, even more so than from the people who are actually held. Yeah. We hear about what it does to kids and what it does to families, and how, I can't count the number of people, like parents who have called and said, my husband, my wife is detained, and my kids are like falling apart, right? Like I have a teenager now who's suicidal. I have an 8-year-old who's like deeply depressed. All of these things that we see really reverberating out.
With regards to the trauma that's experienced, what are the prospects for these detainees if they don't get bond?
So what we say when we're talking about bond is that it is really the most important single intervention in determining the outcome of a case. And that's for a lot of different reasons. One statistic that we use nationally, that's a national number, is that only 14% of detained immigrants have attorneys. And that's, there's no right to counsel in immigration court. There's no public defenders. There's nothing like that. And so, like 14% of people have attorneys. That means just like so many people end up trying to navigate the system without help, without often in a second language without knowing any of the sort of legal intricacies that they're facing. And it's a tough system. I mean, it is confusing. Every immigration attorney will tell you that it is complex and it is difficult. And so detention is a huge, huge, huge barrier to that. And that is, that's a big deal. Detention also really interferes with things that you might do to help your own case. So whether it's like calling your home country to see if you can turn up some documentation. Maybe it's like emailing the people who are still there and seeing if you can get your birth certificate. Whatever it is, right? There's all kinds of things people can do when they're out of custody to support their case and to really build up their case and develop good evidence for it. And that includes like meeting with your attorney, right? If you can just drive to your attorney's office, you can see them more often, you can check in with them more often, you can work with them to build a stronger case. And that is invaluable when it comes to preparing and litigating your case as strongly as possible. The other thing that I think is, the other number that I think is really illustrative is that nationally, 68% of people who get out on bond are ultimately granted relief. So like almost 70% of people who get out don't get deported.
It's huge.
And that's huge.
It's substantial.
And I think that really does show how important it is.
And on the inverse, it's 3% if you don't have bond and you don't have representation.
Right. I mean,
you're going to
really,
have
like,
a successful
it cuts
case.
so much. It cuts
Right.
down
It's
so
almost
much.
zero.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's huge.
For more on Natalia and Julia's work, visit communitybondproject.org. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. As always, check out that last slide and the show description online in order to find sites that I have mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates, please do make sure that you sign up for our newsletter at the address below. It is the best way to get information. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rice to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and set my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for one.